Great to be back with everyone again as we pick up the Mark series once again. And I want to begin today by giving a huge welcome to anyone who's joined with us over the last few weeks who hasn't had the opportunity to meet with us as a community face to face before. And if this is you, I'd like to invite you to send an email to office@chbc.org.au, just introducing yourself, giving some contact details, and myself or another member of the staff team would love to get in contact with you, hear a little bit about your story and answer some questions that you might have about our community. But today we're going to continue this journey through the book of Mark, and perhaps you've joined with us for that already through our morning sermons or our Sunday night discussion panels. And I trust that this series has been an encouragement and a challenge to you as we've looked deeper into the text to see what the text is saying and how it relates to us today. And if you've received any encouragement from this, feel free to share any of our talks. You can do that by going to our YouTube channel and sharing the link with anyone that you think would benefit from listening to them. And if you've heard me talk before, you'd know that I like to start any sermon, any passage by landing it in the context in which it comes from. And today, with the text we're looking at, that comes directly out of the declaration of Peter back from chapter 8, where he says that Jesus is the Christ. And over the subsequent chapters, Jesus has been starting to unpack what this means and trying to challenge some of the preconceived ideas that the disciples have. That they think that the Messiah is particularly attached to this idea of honor and power, and Jesus is trying to reform that. And today we see these themes at the forefront again because the disciples are once again preconceived with this idea of greatness, and they're asking to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus when he comes into glory and power. And this is a very similar passage to what we looked at back on September 6th about this pursuit of greatness. But we're going to look at it down a different angle today. If you want to go back and listen to that talk and wondering what's going on, why are they pursuing greatness, what does this look like, I encourage you to do so. But today, we want to start by going, how did the disciples miss what Jesus was saying about being the Messiah? How could they so clearly miss what he meant by the fact that he was going to die? And for this, it's important for us to try as best we can to get into the mindset of a first century Jewish person and understand what they thought of when they had this image of the Messiah. Who did they expect Jesus to be? Because clearly what we can see in this passage is that the disciples had this image of a triumphant Messiah, someone who was going to come and free them from the oppression that they were under and allow them to live in harmony as God's people. They had this image of a military Messiah, representing that God was the all-conquering God. And this image of honor attached to this, that God was going to reclaim his honor and set his people free, and they got to live in the benefits of that. Because the oppression of Rome that was over them was showing that Rome's might was greater than these other nations and their gods. So the Messiah was going to set them free from Rome and set them free so God proved himself to be all-conquering. And the foundational passage that this comes out of, this image of the Messiah, is from the prophet Ezekiel 37, where he's talking about the Messiah being a servant of the family line of David. And this is what it says. It goes, "My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They will walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. They shall dwell in the land that I gave my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They and their children and their children's children shall dwell there forever. And David my servant shall be their prince forever. I'll make a covenant of peace with them, and shall be an everlasting covenant with them. And I'll set them in the land and multiply them. I'll set my sanctuary in their midst. My dwelling place shall be with them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Then the nations that will know that it is the Lord who sanctifies Israel, when my sanctuary is in their midst." That is that their Messiah is going to be the one king, their one shepherd, the one who will free their lands. And then the nations will see that their God is the God of all. This Messiah was one who was going to liberate Israel from the oppressors. He was great, he was triumphant, he was conqueror. So when this request came from James and John to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus in his glory, they were thinking that this moment had now arrived. That when they got to Jerusalem, they were going to vanquish the Roman occupation. And then they're going to rest at his right and left hand. This is not surprising because there had already been many uprisings and many Messiah-type figures who had risen against Rome. But they might have won the battle for a day or a few days, But then they ultimately died as Romans took back the occupation, took back the rule. But for the disciples, they were going to Jerusalem. They were going to win this time. Jesus was the true Messiah. But this was not to be the case. Jesus didn't come to overthrow the Roman occupation that was suppressing Israel. No, Jesus came to give his life as a ransom for many. That's what he's saying in this text. And the disciples are going, no, 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 no. You can't be the conquering Messiah and die, Jesus. You can't be flaky. We're committed to this. We're going to see it through. We're going to win once and for all. You're the Messiah. That was their image. They couldn't get their head around why Jesus had to die. Now, I wonder if we stop right here for a minute and I was to ask you, why did Jesus have to die? How would you explain that? What answer would you give? Why do you think Jesus had to die? Well, today, this is what we're going to hone in on. Because after this passage, what we see in the text we're going to look over the next few weeks is that it's all building up and leading directly to Jesus' death. The fact that Jesus does die. So we're going to ask, why did Jesus have to die? What is that about? And to understand this, why Jesus had to die, we need to journey right back to the beginning of the story. We need to understand what's going on from the start. Now, the story begins by introducing God in the creation narrative. That is, he's seen as the author of all things. He's the author of all reality. And God has within himself the power to take the chaos of the unformed world and speak order, purpose, and life into it and transforms it into a beautiful garden. A place for humans that they can dwell, they can flourish. And he looks at it and calls it good. He names it as being good. Then God creates two humans, Adam and Eve, or the Adam meaning humanity and Eve meaning life. And they're created to be his image bearers, and he places them into this garden. They then, as his image bearers, are called to be God's representatives. They are to rule over the garden, to carry on his work of harnessing the potential in creation and transforming it from beauty to beauty. They themselves are called to represent God by speaking order, purpose, and life into his creation. But they had a choice. And this choice is depicted through the portrayal of a tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You see, up until this point in the story, it's been God who has declared what is good and what is evil. But with a tree, humanity had a choice. They could accept God's definition of what is good and evil, or they could seize autonomy and begin to define it for themselves to say, this is what we say is good. And God warned them, if they chose that path, if they went down that road, then they would surely die. And it's this point in the story that we first meet the adversary. It's depicted by the image of a serpent. And this serpent, this adversary, convinces humanity that if they define good and evil for themselves, they won't die, but they will become like gods themselves. They would be able to rule and define life and dictate the direction that the world goes in. So humanity gave into this temptation, the temptation for seizing autonomy for themselves, for seizing power for themselves, and they subsequently fall. And with this knowledge, with the ability to define what is good and evil, they then become suspicious of one another. As they look out for their own interests of, I think this is good, so this is what I'm going to hold on to, it led to a degree of self-protection. They had to protect their interests. And this resulted in fractured relationships one to another. And humanity then began to grab for power for themselves. And this hunger for power, it grew, and this drive and this desire for power, it grew, that became violent power grabs. And then civilizations grew, and they began to define what was evil and call what was evil good. And humanity fell. They fell out of step with God. They fell out of step with his definition of what is good. They fell out of relationship with each other as they looked out for their own interests. They fell into temptation. They fell into sin, where they decided to call the shots for themselves and do what is good for me, even at the cost of you. And they fell out of God's paradise. And God mournfully, regretfully allows humanity to define what is good for themselves in this garden, this paradise that falls into chaos. Instead of speaking order and purpose and life into the creation, humanity chooses to speak chaos and death and despair, destroying God's creation, subsequently placing themselves in a position of hostility towards God and what He is calling good, finding themselves in rebellion against God as His enemies. They pick a fight with the Creator of the universe. They pick a fight with Him as His enemies and then position themselves under His judgment and anger. The story does not leave us without hope, though, because God promises that one day the seed of the woman, an offspring of the woman, will return and would ultimately destroy the serpent, destroy the source of all evil, the one who leads humanity in rebellion against God. But in that process of crushing the serpent's head, this seed of Eve would receive a lethal blow, will receive a wound, and will result in their mutual destruction. And throughout the Old Testament, we see God calling a nation to be His representatives, His light to the nations. They were called to speak order, purpose, and life, so people would see the presence of God wherever they went. And the leaders of this, as we see them rise up, always come with the question, is this going to be the seed of Eve that's going to set the world back into order, to get the balance right, to speak order, purpose, and life into the new chaos that God's people and creation has found itself in? But the only problem is that each of these characters, whether it's Abraham, Noah, Moses, the judges, David, one of the kings, just to name a few, they all give in to the same temptation to seize power and redefine what is good and evil for themselves. And ultimately, God's people find themselves enslaved again to a nation that is saying what is evil is now good and oppressing God. However, the story isn't over, because the prophets talk about a coming Messiah, the one who will liberate God's people and establish them in their own land and restore them into right relationship with God. And He's going to be their true king and shepherd. This is what the disciples were hoping for. This is who Peter declared Jesus to be. However, not once do they link this image in Ezekiel with the image in Isaiah of a suffering servant. So then Jesus comes, born of the line of David, son of man, seed of Eve. He comes as a messenger of God's kingdom. He resists the serpent's temptation in the wilderness. He doesn't choose to define what is good and evil for himself. No, he walks out of there and he goes and teaches what God's definition of what is good and evil is to the people. He heals the effects of chaos in people's lives through healing diseases and driving spirits out. He also goes on and forgives sin and removes the effects of sin in the world, and shares that real power is not seen through living for yourselves and grabbing power for yourselves, but real power comes from living in service to others, through offering your life as a sacrifice. But Jesus didn't just claim to be a messenger of the kingdom like one of the prophets of old, but He rather revealed Himself to be the king of this kingdom, the creator. He revealed Himself to be God Himself. And in doing this, He angered the religious leaders and those in positions of power who conspired together to kill Him. And Jesus let them do it willingly, by way of offering Himself as an ultimate sacrifice. In doing so, Jesus confronts the effects of evil head on. He takes the consequences of evil into Himself and allows them to crush Him. And it answers the question, how is God going to overcome evil and destruction? And the answer lies within the sacrificial love of Jesus in offering Himself to death. And in doing this, Jesus allows the effects of evil to crush Him and fulfilling the proclamation that He's going to destroy the serpent's power. And He does that by suffering this wound Himself, as all of humanity's evil is poured into Him and crushes Him. Just as Isaiah says, He dies the most shameful and humiliating death on a cross. He does this only to rise again. And He rises from death and evil to show that the sacrificial love of Jesus has conquered and finally allows humanity to have a real choice. They can choose to remain in the old way and bring about chaos, death, and despair. Or they can choose to walk in Jesus' way, rejoining God's purpose as His image bearers, speaking order, purpose, and life into the chaos of the world around them. And if they're going to do this, in Jesus' death, He transforms them and fills them with His power and presence to transform their hearts and their minds so they can make the right choice and be energized by God's power to fulfill this. This is why Jesus had to die. Paul puts it this way. In Romans 5, he says, "Therefore, we have been made right in God's sight by faith. with the peace of God because of what Jesus Christ our Lord has done for us. Because of our faith, Jesus has brought us into this place of undeserved privilege where we can now stand and confidently and joyfully look forward to sharing God's glory. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. And since we've been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his Son while we're still his enemies, we'll certainly be saved through the life of his Son. So now we can rejoice in this wonderful new relationship with God because our Lord Jesus Christ has made us friends with God. Jesus had to die as a ransom for us, to restore us, to transform us from the effects of the fall. We have all experienced the effects of this fall, the effects of the chaos in our world and inside each of us individually and communally. And if I'm honest with you today, I can quite easily say the statement, I did a horrible thing. I've done horrible things. I'm sure you can say the same thing too. It's part of our combined human experience. And Jesus died. He had to die so he could transform that. See, we're all created good, with purpose and life, made as God's image. But as a result of the fall, sin permeates in all of our lives and affects us both in our external behaviors and our internal being. It permeates in our external behaviors, in the things that we do, the decisions we make, how we live. And as we define what is good for ourselves, and this brings guilt, as we look out for our own interests and define what is good against what God says is good. That is, I did a horrible thing. But it also permeates in our internal being, bringing shame. It impacts how we see ourselves in relation to God, in relation to other people, how we interpret who we are. That isn't saying I did a horrible thing, but I did that horrible thing. It's me. I'm the one who chose to do that. This impacts who I am. I fall short of God's glory. I dishonor who God is. I'm not living up to who he's created me to be. I'm the one who did this. It's my fault. And this shame gets impacted and more layers get added as other people make decisions for themselves and they push us down the rung and we become victims of their sin. And this adds layers and layers to our shame. When we do something wrong, when we're guilty, it might make us want to apologize or to justify why we did that or confess our wrongdoing. When it comes to shame, it makes us want to run and hide. It makes us want to escape. Or it might make us want to strike back and pull that other person down. And the good news is that Jesus died so we can be transformed for both of these. See, God has a clear definition of what he calls good. In the simplest form, this comes through living as his image bearers. That is, what is good is when we live as people who speak God's order, purpose, and life into the situations around us. But when we define this for ourselves, we find that when we grab it for ourselves, our actions speak chaos, death, and despair. If we want to discover a real clear definition of what God calls to be good, we can look straight at his laws, at what he says this is the model of the way you could live. Look at 10 commandments and these simple things. He goes, this is the 10 simple things of how to live. And if we ask ourselves, how do I go measuring up to this? I wonder what we'd say. Maybe we'd ask ourselves if we've ever told a lie. If we've ever stolen something small or large. If we've ever misappropriated God's name, that's like using it as a swear word, or spoken about God in a way that doesn't reflect his character and his being. Maybe you might go, have I ever lusted after someone? Have I ever desired to be with someone that wasn't my partner? Have I ever hated someone, wished ill upon someone, wished they'll fall into suffering? You see, if you've answered yes to any of these, then you'll be admitting that you're a liar or a thief, blasphemer, or someone that Jesus would define as committing adultery, chasing after that person, or murdering someone, wishing they were dead. We would do those things in our heart. And if we said yes to these, that's only 5 of the 10 commandments. And you have to ask, how can my sin be forgiven? And the answer is that Jesus died for my sin. I can be forgiven. God loves me for those He loves me so much that he takes those sins. If I accept Jesus by faith, he gets rid of those sins. He dies for those sins so that now they're associated with him and I can walk free from the burden of that sin. This is good news. But what do we do with how I feel about myself? How this impacts the view of myself? You see, it's one thing to be positionally free before God, another thing entirely to be able to walk free. That is something that I think that we fail to grasp so much as the church today. While many of us believe in Jesus and he knows that he died for our sin, when we look in the mirror each day, we see someone who is a wretch, who is dirty, who needs to keep coming back and asking for forgiveness, someone who's unlovable. We speak chaos and death and despair over our own lives because that's who we see looking back at us. We see someone who we think God can only tolerate. God hates the fact that I do these things. You see, honor makes life worthwhile, whereas shame is a living death. Honor involves recognition and openly acknowledging esteem of others, which renders a person valuable in their own eyes and in others' eyes. But for many of us, we walk around each day with the weight of shame on our back, effectively destroying our lives, robbing our joy, and screaming in our ears and in our heart. We sing songs to God, but we feel hypocritical for them. We speak words of encouragement to others that we wish we could believe or say over ourselves. We trust God in a moment, but we feel like that's stolen in the next. So what do we do when we look in the mirror and we know that we are forgiven for doing bad things, but I need to reconcile the fact that I'm the one who did that. I'm the one who did the bad thing. I'm the one who's done evil. It was I who drove Jesus to give up his life. How can my sin and shame be covered? How can my honor be restored when it's me who did that? Well, Jesus took on the cross and he didn't die a peaceful death in a bed. No, it's in the cross he dies the most shameful death. He took the shame, not just the guilt, but the shame to reclaim God's honor. He takes away the shame. In his death, he absorbs this shame from us and restores us to God. So the shame has been dealt with and all that remains is love. Jesus dies as the divine King to rescue shameful sinners. He then covers us with his life. He is the source of our honor. He is the source of our value. He's not saying you are defined by what you did. No, you're defined by the fact that I did this for you. You're defined as someone who is valuable, who is forgiven, who is worthwhile, who is loved, because that's what I say about you and that's what matters. That's what counts. It's my word that counts. And in doing so, he gives us a new identity. He calls us his friends. He invites us to be part of his family. And he comes and he dwells with us. He makes us his bride, his children of the King. He transforms us, he restores us, and moves us from glory to glory. And that reality is available for you if you want to believe it by faith today, if you allow Jesus to define who you are. You see, the Jews were right. The Messiah is the one true King, the only shepherd. He's the one who will restore the land and speak order and purpose and life into the chaos, death and despair of our world and of our own lives. But he does that through his sacrificial, selfless love. He didn't take the sword into battle, because if he did, he'll perpetuate the pain, the chaos, death and destruction that would bring. But through absorbing it into himself, he conquers death and evil and brings the hope of new life. He brings that firstly in the lives of those who follow him, and he transforms them. So each of us can go out and transform others in the world that we live in by being his representatives and his reflection, his image, and speak order, purpose and life. That is why Jesus had to die. Now imagine what would happen if us as a community stepped into this calling fully. If we lived lives in light of the resurrected Jesus, knowing that Jesus died to remove our guilt and our shame and rose to new life conquering death and evil, so we can walk as his people, empowered by his Spirit to go out and speak order, purpose, and life into every situation that we come into. So we can look at those and say, "O death, where is your sting?" So what does this mean for us now? Where do we find ourselves now? Well, perhaps for you, there's some external behaviors that you know that you've done that have rendered you guilty before God, where you've chosen to define saying there's evil as good and you've walked into that. And today you need to acknowledge to Jesus, go, "I've done this, can I be forgiven? Can my guilt be taken away?" And we're going to have an opportunity to do that. Or maybe you have asked for forgiveness and walk under this burden of shame. And today you need to allow Jesus to absorb that shame for you, so you can walk freely as a new identity, knowing that he's working in your life and allowing him to transform you from glory to glory, to allow him to define who you are and believe that by faith. Today we're going to have an opportunity, if that's you, to ask God to do that and to give that to God. Ask him to take the shame. So I'm going to invite you to pray with me now if that you're in one of those two categories, and come before God. And after that, Andrew's going to lead us in a time of communion together where we can celebrate Jesus' death and what it's achieved in our lives. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you that Jesus came and died. He died in our place as we were defining what is evil as good in rebellion against you. Jesus stepped in. He didn't succumb to that. He chose to live up and be your representative and to die in our place. To die so we can be set free, not just from Rome, but from the evil one, our adversary, the one who's leading us to define evil as good and rise in rebellion against you. I thank you that Jesus died and rose again so we can have new life. But Father, I acknowledge that in my life and many people's lives, we make decisions where we wanted to seize that autonomy, that control again, and make decisions that go against you and define good and evil for ourselves. And if that's you today, I invite you to pray with me now and say, "Jesus, I'm sorry for those moments where I've defined good and evil for myself and have found myself in rebellion against you. Can you please take this guilt away from me? I believe that you died in my place to set me free so that I can have right relationship with you. Thank you for that." But we also know that for many of us as well, we walk around with the burden of shame over our lives, knowing that it is I who did those things. If that's you today, I pray that I ask you to join with me in praying this. Jesus, I acknowledge that you died in my place and that I'm free, but I don't feel free. Would you come into my life and allow your words to transform the way I see myself, that I may walk free in your presence? Would you transform how I see my identity so I can live free without the burden of shame? Would you take that away and absorb that in your cross? I believe this now by faith. Amen.